It's about damn time, isn't it? It's been almost 3 years since I covered Metroid, 2D Metroid to be precise. Just to recap, Super Metroid, Fusion, Zero Mission, AM2R, and Dread are some of my favorite games of all time, and the Metroid brand to me represents excellence and has, for the most part, maintained an unrivaled quality in the ever-expansive genre of action-adventure games. One of the best decisions I ever made was taking a chance on a new game I had never heard of before, one that I traded my original copy of Super Mario Sunshine for. It was one of the games that brought me out of my video game comfort zone, which consisted of Mario, Donkey Kong, a Sonic title here and there, and licensed games, the good kind and the bad kind. And thankfully, this new game just so happened to knock my frickin' socks off. Metroid Prime, along with its sequels Metroid Prime 2 Echoes and Metroid Prime 3 Corruption, form a trilogy that is widely considered to be developer Retro Studios' crowning achievement. Retro was given a seemingly impossible task, bringing Metroid into 3D while preserving everything that made the 2D titles so acclaimed: meaningful exploration, power-up based progression, and that feeling of isolation and solitude from getting lost in an unknown world. And they succeeded against all odds, even when the daring decision was made to make 3D Metroid a first-person sub-series. But the Prime games aren't a run-of-the-mill FPS take on Metroid. They are Metroid adventures through and through that just so happen to be played from a unique point of view. And the first-person gameplay of the Prime Trilogy allows for an extraordinarily immersive way to digest and experience the Metroid universe, giving the Prime games their own flair and style when compared to the 2D entries. With all that being said, let's get this show on the road. The trilogy will be what I mainly focus on, but every Prime game will be mentioned, even if just for a bit. So buckle up. This is my Metroid Prime Retrospective. After Super Metroid descended from the heavens and released for the Super Nintendo in 1994, fans of Metroid had to wait 8 whole years to play the next installment. In that period of time, the Nintendo 64 came out, and many of Nintendo's most popular franchises made the jump to 3D, except for Metroid. Not a single Metroid game came out for the 64, and the only table scraps of Metroid content people got on the system was Samus's inclusion in Super Smash Bros. Damn, at least during the second drought we got 2 Smash games and a minigame in Nintendo Land. So why did Metroid skip the Nintendo 64? Well, part of the reason may have been that Gunpei Yokoi, fellow visionary at Nintendo and producer of the first 3 Metroid games, left the company in 1996, 1 year before his tragic passing in 1997. The main reason, however, has been largely attributed to the simple fact that 3D game development was a real challenge for Nintendo during this period, and they simply couldn't figure out how Metroid would make the transition. This doesn't mean that an attempt wasn't made, however. According to Yoshio Sakamoto, longtime director and producer of the series, a third-party company was approached to develop a Metroid game for the N64, but these plans fell through when the unnamed developer said that they weren't convinced that they could make something good with the IP, much less something that could compare to Super Metroid. But in 1998, thanks to a joint effort between Nintendo and Jeff Spangenberg, founder of Iguana Entertainment, Retro Studios was born. And almost as soon as they were up and running, Retro began working on various projects for the then still in production Nintendo GameCube. One of these games was an action-adventure title they called Metaforce, and upon seeing a demo of the game in action, Shigeru Miyamoto himself recommended that Retro turn Metaforce into a new Metroid game. With this approval, Retro Studios basically cancelled all of their other in-the-works projects to focus their efforts on the one that would come to be known as Metroid Prime. The game was first shown at Space World 2000 in a montage of games being worked on for the GameCube, and at E3 2001, gameplay was shown to the public for the first time and received quite a few negative reactions from the press and fans alike. Metroid Prime was quickly written off as a game that would be dead on arrival solely because of the first-person perspective. People were very vocal about how they felt that this wasn't Metroid. And sure, with the benefit of hindsight, it's easy to say that they didn't know what they were talking about, but looking at this bit of early footage, I can't blame them for feeling unconvinced, if only because of how Samus's arm cannon looks. It's fucking gross. In spite of the demoralizing response from the public, Retro and Nintendo especially had full faith in the project project, so much so that in 2002, Nintendo officially made Retro Studios a subsidiary of theirs after buying $1 million worth of their stock. Definitely one of their best investments, as Retro also went on to make the modern Donkey Kong Country games, with Tropical Freeze being one of the best 2D platformers of all time. After roughly 3 years of development and a whole lot of crunch, Metroid Prime came out in North America on November 18th, 2002, and it only became, one of the most critically acclaimed games of all time and held the title of best-selling Metroid game for nearly 2 decades before Dread dethroned it. Also, Metroid Fusion came out on that same day, so all in all, it was a really big day for unemployed Metroid fans. 8 years after Super Metroid came out, not only did fans get its direct follow-up, they also got the first 3D Metroid game, and it looked, sounded, and played amazingly, surpassing nearly everybody's expectations. Just getting it out of the way now, this right here, in my humble opinion, is one of the greatest games of all time and is probably my favorite Metroid game. I flip-flop back and forth on whether I like Prime more than Super and vice versa, so take that with a grain of salt. But all I know for certain is that Metroid Prime is one of those games that, when I'm in the middle of playing it, it consistently makes me say, this is the best game in the history of mankind. So let's take a look at the beginning of Prime. Metroid Prime begins with Samus responding to a distress signal emitting from a space station orbiting the planet Talon 4. The station, which turns out to be a space pirate base called the frigate Orpheon, serves as the game's intro and tutorial, a direct parallel to Super Metroid's opening. Much like Zelda, Metroid's first foray into 3D, in more ways than one, feels like a reimagining of the franchise's last 2D home console entry. In Prime's case, I believe that the game's similarities to Super are not only here because Super was considered the franchise's golden goose at this point in time, but because the resemblance is able to give players a clear frame of reference regarding how a first-person Metroid game can provide an improved sense of atmosphere and tension when it feels like you're actually in the world and in the shoes of Samus. This isn't me trying to undermine Super Metroid's accomplishments on Super Nintendo hardware, not at all, but Prime handled immersion in a way few other games did at the time, by putting a lot of thought and care into the small details. Remember in Super Metroid when you land in Crateria, a rainforest-like biome? Prime thrusts you into a very familiar setting when you land in Talon Overworld for the first time, but now you can also see the water droplets as they land on Samus's visor, and you can look up at the sky to see the rain pouring down. You can look around and gawk at the majesty of this breathtaking world in a way that Metroid just couldn't do in the past. I know this phrase has become a meme at this point, but Metroid Prime really makes you feel like Samus Aran. You can see how her vision is affected by the way her visor reacts to outside forces. When she gets hit, the screen shakes a bit, indicating an impact. Her lens gets fogged up when there's moisture in the air. If she's hit by an electrical attack, the screen gets all staticky, and it shuts down completely when all of her energy is depleted as she screams in pain. That scream and the game over screen that follows it freaked me the hell out when I saw it for the first time as a kid. Going back to the visor's interface, all the information that used to be displayed at the top of the screen in a very video gamey way, like Samus's energy and missile count, has been retooled to be a part of her visor's lens, showing that she is constantly monitoring her vitals, ammo, the beam she has equipped, and proximity sensors that rise when she gets close to a dangerous substance like lava. It also displays what type of visor she is currently using. Apart from her main one, the only other visor you have access to when starting a new game is the scan visor. The scan feature, one of the Prime series' signature mechanics, is used to activate elevators and other such devices, but it also allows Samus and the player to inspect and analyze environmental points of interest, learning more about the world and what exactly is going on by doing so. Scannable objects are the way that Metroid Prime relays its story to you. That is, if you decide to scan things in the first place. You get general world-building tidbits by scanning enemies and random terminals and whatnot, and let me just say, it is impressive impressive just how much text is in this game. But the Chozo lore and the space pirate data logs that you can stumble upon throughout your adventure are the only sources of information that explain Prime's overarching plot of how the space pirates have been experimenting with a volatile energy source called Phazon to create chemically enhanced soldiers and Metroids. Phazon also happens to be the great poison that the Chozo frequently refer to in the Chozo lore, originating from a meteor that crashed into Talon 4 an unspecified number of years ago. One of my favorite fake-outs, assuming that you scan every Chozo lore during your first visit to the Chozo ruins for it to have the intended effect, is that it seems at first that the great poison is just the polluted water in the ruins that gets purified when you defeat Flagra. But nope, it runs much deeper than that, as you eventually learn that the real poison not only killed the Chozo on this planet and corrupted some of them, turning them into aggressive spirits that attack Samus on sight, but the true source of the poison is a life form of pure Phazon, the titular Metroid Prime, that the Chozo had sealed away deep within the impact crater it formed, a seal that the space pirates are desperately trying to break in hopes of controlling the creature for their nefarious purposes. The reason as to why there are items across the planet for Samus to collect is because her arrival was foretold, so the Chozo left all these power-ups for her to find to aid her in her quest to gain entry into the impact crater and neutralize the source of the Phazon. You won't know about any of this though unless you scan shit. The closest thing you'll get to a story if you don't take the time to read the data logs is Samus is hunting a reanimated Ridley, referred to as Meta Ridley in this game, and rains hell on Talon 4 and the space pirate bases on the planet while on her murder mission. Metroid Prime featured the most involved narrative in the franchise thus far, but it is also completely missable, which I think is great for the sake of moving things along on subsequent playthroughs, and also for keeping that element of choice and freedom that characterizes many of the most beloved games in the series. And if you don't give a crap about scanning stuff to piece together a plot, you at least have Samus's characterization to keep you entertained. I mean, it isn't much, she doesn't talk, which is par for the course, but I just like seeing how she reacts to getting a new power-up, or how she has to take a moment to recuperate after a long fall, or when she gets bonked with a rock after the Thardos fight, the way she stares at the first Metroid she comes across on the planet, as if she's thinking, God damn it. Luckily for her, Metroids are a joke in this game, since you can kill them with basically any weapon now. My absolute favorite moment has to be after you defeat the Elite Pirate. Its massive body tips over and lands on Samus, and the large amount of Phazon mutates with her suit, turning it into the Phazon suit. But as this happens, she writhes in pain, presumably from the Phazon infusion, then nonchalantly does this badass pose. Thing is, this scene is only in the GameCube version. The Wii version, and sadly even remastered, replace it with this scene, which is kinda lame. Yeah, so there are 3 main versions of Prime 1 you can play, and there are quite a few things that set them all apart, more than you may expect. Of course, there are the gameplay changes, which I'll get into in a bit, but things like scan logs, animations, enemy placements, obstacles, and even audio have minute differences across versions. To be more specific, the Wii version introduced most of these changes, and just so you know, Remastered on the Switch is mostly based on the Wii version. The North American GameCube version is missing the opening narration, has more opportunities to sequence break that later revisions either patched out or made more difficult, and contains inconsistencies in some of its pirate logs that were later retconned. Here, the space pirates talk about the experiments they've been conducting on Metroid Prime, but they also mention that they can't figure out how to use the artifacts to break the seal leading to the impact crater, which is where Metroid Prime is supposedly imprisoned. Whoops. Even if you have Prime on GameCube, your copy may be different from somebody else's. If you have the Black Label print, chances are you have the 1.0 build of the game. Some interesting quirks in this version include scan dashing, a technique that makes the early space jump sequence break easier to pull off than in later versions. Flagra's boss theme only plays the first 30 seconds before looping, and Ice Streak bats in the Fendrana Drifts are a one-time scan. So if you ever wondered why you only have 99% of the logbook filled out, that may be why. But of course, the biggest thing that sets each version apart is how the game plays. And also, you know, the fact that Remastered looks like a freaking PS4 game and runs at a smooth 60 FPS. Like, oh my god, this game looks goddamn ridiculous. The original already looked great, but this is on another level. They removed the reflections and the thermal visor is blurry. this game. Back on topic, Prime, as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, is not a traditional FPS in the sense that shooting isn't the game's primary focus. Well, you do a lot of shooting, but the gunplay is more about positioning and evading and waiting for an opening to deal damage rather than aiming precisely. Because of this, Prime on GameCube doesn't have a conventional dual-stick control scheme. There is free aim, and it is useful for looking around and for nailing shots from far away, but you can't move while doing this. You'll mostly be relying on the lock-on to make your shots, which I am totally fine with. Like I said, there is more to Prime's combat than simply trying to hit your target, so the lock-on doesn't feel like a win button. With these controls, this frees up the C-stick for beam swapping on the fly, and same goes for your visors, which are mapped to the D-pad. The Wii versions of Prime 1 and Prime 2 for that matter essentially grants the first two Prime games the benefits of Prime 3's pointer-based control setup. Now you can move and aim freely at the same time, and if I haven't made it clear enough in the past, I love pointer controls that grant extra flexibility like this, and they work wonders for the Prime games. You even have the option to enable the way the lock-on functioned in the original, if you're not a fan of free aim being on when targeting something. Unfortunately, beam and visor switching is less snappy than on GameCube, as it now requires you to hold either the plus or minus buttons respectively, point to the beam or visor you want, and then release the button to select it. But this didn't stop the Wii versions from being my preferred means of playing these games for the longest time. But in Prime 1's case, I now prefer remastered above everything else. Options to use classic, Wii, hybrid, and new dual-stick controls? Sign me the hell up. Except they switched the mapping for the scan and x-ray visors, those bastards. Regardless of which version you play, Metroid Prime's gameplay is pretty dang smooth. The opening in the frigate gets you up to speed with the game's controls and core mechanics. You learn that your charge beam can be used to draw in health and ammo drops, and the morph ball gives you a third-person view of your surroundings for better visibility and control over the ball. Side note, I really enjoy the pirate log that goes into the space pirates' attempts to reverse engineer Samus's equipment, and that their test subjects were horribly mutilated during the morph ball tests. The morph ball was always fun to mess with in the previous games, but in Prime, it realistically reacts to terrain and has proper physics, accelerating when rolling downhill and slowing down when going up. The boost ball, one of the new power-ups that Prime introduced, lets you charge the morph ball and release its energy to gain a burst of speed, and you need to use this speed to make your way up half-pipe structures, putting the game's physics engine on full display. I love combining the boost ball with the spring ball, the latter of which being exclusive to the Wii version and remastered, to make traversing through zones super swift. It's a good substitute for the absent speed booster. The spring ball trivializes pretty much every bomb jump puzzle in the game, which is a little funny. And hey, bomb jumping's back, but the technique is heavily nerfed. In the 2D games, you can bomb jump infinitely with proper timing, but Prime has a long cooldown before you can get your bomb charges back. This was definitely done to prevent players from breaking the levels in half with insane sequence breaks, the same reason that the space jump is simply a double jump here, and why the spider ball can only latch onto these magnetic rails. The properties of some beams were also tweaked in the transition to 3D. The wave and plasma beams no longer go through walls and enemies, and have instead been given new attributes. The wave beam is now an electric-based attack that can stun enemies when charged and activate these conduits required to solve some puzzles, and the plasma beam is now heat-based and fucking eviscerates everything. Since Metroid Prime lets you swap beam types, an effort was made to make each beam more distinct than ever, giving you reasons to use one over the others depending on the situation. Certain doors can only be opened with the beam of the corresponding color, and in combat, they each have their pros and cons. The power beam has the fastest fire rate at the cost of having the weakest damage output, and it's the only weapon that works against the stupid-ass Chozo ghosts. I already went over the wave beam's new gimmick, and while it's more powerful than the power beam, it has a slower rate of fire. The ice beam, man, I love the ice beam. It's the slowest beam by far, but just like in the 2D games, it can freeze nearly every enemy. Following an ice shot with a missile, well, you can put two and two together. And the plasma beam, there really isn't much of a downside to this weapon, it just fucks everything. Okay, it does have a very limited range when uncharged, and the flamethrower, its beam combo, is the worst one in the game, with pitiful reach and disappointing attack power. Beam combos give you yet another reason to switch beam types. You can find these hidden across the planet, and they let you perform a powerful attack at the cost of some missiles. The power beam gets the super missile, the only beam combo that's actually required to beat the game. Unlike Super Metroid, the super missile doesn't have its own ammo type in Prime. Instead, it consumes 5 missiles per use. The Wave Buster shoots a continuous stream of electricity that latches onto the nearest enemy, and will latch onto nearby enemies when the current enemy being attacked is killed. It eats up missiles like crazy, but it is stupidly strong, and the Ice Spreader, for 10 missiles, covers a large area with ice upon impact. Doesn't seem that exciting, but against the final boss, the ice spreader freezes it in place and forces it to switch to the next phase with one shot. The 3 optional beam combos are actually pretty well hidden. They're some of the most memorable collectibles in the game, if only because of the means in which they're obtained. To get the Wave Buster, you have to collapse this sun tower in the Chozo ruins and climb to the top, and for the ice spreader, you need to power bomb this glass tunnel in the Magmoor Caverns, yet another callback to Super Metroid. Also, the Magmoor Caverns theme is literally just Ridley's lair from Super Metroid as well. I wasn't kidding when I said that Metroid Prime is basically a reimagining of Super, right down to the power-ups. Something that I really like about Prime specifically though, is that it gives you control of a pretty powered up Samus right from the get-go before stripping you of nearly all of your items during the opening escape sequence. It makes your arrival to Talon 4 feel that much more dangerous, since the game intentionally made you get comfortable with your fancy weapons, just so that you know what you're missing out on when the real game begins. The Chozo Ruins, the first real main area you explore, takes you through a linear, albeit incredibly rewarding path in which you recoup most of your lost items along the way. Little by little, you start becoming whole again, and after obtaining the Varia suit, now you truly feel unstoppable. And now that you have a good number of items, you can go through the ruins again and get those expansions that were previously out of reach and taunting you. And the elevator room, located a few rooms beyond the Flagra arena, houses 4 branching paths that each loop back to rooms you previously visited to make item hunting more convenient. Chozo Ruins is probably my favorite area when just taking the exploration factor into account. The level design here is so well thought out. You'll find some new path and before you know it, you'll get spit out into a room you were just in. It's the Dark Souls of Metroid. Sadly, I can't say the same for Magmoor Caverns, the next area you go to. The music is a banger, but in terms of its layout, it is incredibly linear, and later in the game, you're going to find yourself running from one end of the map all the way to the other end constantly, which is related to Metroid Prime's backtracking issue, but I'll get to that in a sec. It doesn't help that the only 2 elevators that take you to Phendrana Drifts are in Magmoor Caverns. Speaking of Phendrana, this area isn't much better in terms of how much of a straight line it feels like, but boy is it pretty. This is one of my favorite snow locations in all of gaming. It feels so peaceful and calm compared to the area you just exited. And honestly, a big thing that makes Phendrana so great is the relaxing music. The Metroid Prime Trilogy has a distinctive sound to its compositions that, when you listen to a track outside of the game, you can almost immediately point out that it's from a Prime game. The 2D games lean in more on ambient pieces of music, while Prime highlights the sci-fi side of the franchise with its emphasis on synth, techno, and electronic sounding instruments. Flutes and whistling get thrown into a good amount of the songs too, for good measure. It is such an iconic soundtrack that it is what I automatically think of whenever futuristic space settings come to mind. And while I wouldn't say it's as ambient as, say, Super Metroid, the soundtrack can still be incredibly atmospheric, like the theme of the sunken space pirate frigate. The music in some areas also changes depending on how far into the game you are. Talon Overworld starts with a slow and grandiose remix of Brinstar, which sounds glorious and gets you pumped up for the adventure that awaits you. But after getting Spider Ball, the second theme kicks in, and it feels a bit more in line with the rest of Prime's unique sound. Metroid Prime's soundtrack is also responsible for making my first visit to the Impact Crater one of the most memorable, jaw-dropping moments I've experienced in all my years playing video games. To give some context, I was stuck for quite a while on my first playthrough after getting the boost ball. The game's hint system told me where my next objective was, but I just couldn't figure out what to do there. It didn't help that I didn't know what the hell a half-pipe was at the time, and I had somehow managed to make it out of the boost ball room in Phendrana without using the half-pipe there. I thought maybe I missed something in one of the other areas, and so for about a week, I scoured nearly every inch of the map, Indeed, this was also the first time I ever got stuck and lost in a Metroid game, and after I finally learned what I needed to do to proceed, and after having the sights and sounds of every other area in the game seared into my brain, I saw this door in the landing site that I had completely ignored. I went through it, rolled through that glass tunnel and those stone halls, until I ended up here and was treated to this song. I felt that I had slipped into some kind of out-of-bounds area. The only other thing I had seen in a video game that compared to this was when I managed to enter the Valley of Bowser early in Super Mario World through one of the warp pipes on the overworld I unlocked by taking a secret exit. The vibe I got from both of these places was that I shouldn't be here, that I wasn't ready to be here. It turns out I needed the 12 Chozo artifacts, and hints pointing to their hiding spots could be viewed by scanning the pillars. It started to dawn on me that the game was far from over. I still had 11 of these to collect before I could unlock the seal here. This is when I knew that this was one of the best games ever made, but the process of beating it wasn't going to be easy. Because see, I needed those 12 artifacts, and unfortunately, the hunt for the Chozo artifacts highlights Metroid Prime's most infamous traits, its world design and its excessive amount of backtracking. Now, I'm just gonna come out and say that I think I'm gonna be a little bit nicer about Prime's backtracking than most people tend to be, but that doesn't mean I don't agree that it can be incredibly arduous. Going back to my story, upon leaving the impact crater, I realized that I had to use my newly acquired space jump boots to go back and open a previously unreachable door in the Phendrana Drifts. Even though, not counting all the running around I did in between the boost ball and the space jump, I was just there. Metroid Prime has a habit of making you backtrack to an area on the other side of the map after getting some item that opens up a new path there, just to make you backtrack again through almost the exact same route you used to get there, and this kind of design repeats itself constantly. To give another example, after getting the spider ball, your next stop is the Chozo ruins to get the ice beam, all because you needed to open this door to trudge deeper into the Phendrana Drifts, a door that's in a room not far from where you got the spider ball. Taking the layout of Magmoor Caverns into account again, that means you need to go down this elevator that takes you to Magmoor, run all the way over to the Chozo ruins elevator, make your way to the furnace room to use the spider ball track, and proceed through the subsequent rooms until you reach the one hiding the ice beam after blowing up some fucking toads. Then take this elevator to Talon Overworld, but not this one because that one leads to a dead end, you dumbass. Take the elevator from Talon Overworld to get back to Magmoor Caverns, and finally take the elevator here to Phendrana to reach the room with the ice beam door. All of this just to get the gravity suit so that you can explore the sunken frigate, which is back in Talon Overworld. That sounds ridiculous. And it is. However, to the game's credit, while the backtracking journeys themselves can be long and tedious, they also give you an excuse to do some item cleanup so that the endgame cleanup doesn't take you as long. When you revisit the Chozo ruins to get the ice beam, for instance, the devs more than likely intended for you to spend a good amount of time here looking for missile expansions and energy tanks and the like. Whenever the game asks you to backtrack, you can bet that there are plenty of newly accessible expansions ripe for the taking, and given how many missiles the beam combos use up, and how some bosses like Meta Ridley and Metroid Prime can be real damage sponges, or how the Phazon Mines is a glorified gauntlet of powerful enemies and hazards where health management is paramount, it's in your best interest to get as many pickups as you can. Nowhere is backtracking more prevalent though than when looking for the Chozo artifacts, a quest that I usually save for the end anyways, because a lot of them require late game upgrades like power bombs and the grapple beam. And even though you can collect quite a few of the expansions along the way of the main story path, many of them are just more convenient to get if you save them for the endgame artifact hunt. Like, there's really no reason to revisit the second half of Phendrana Drifts until you get the plasma beam, one of the last mandatory upgrades. Sure, there's a power bomb expansion here that only requires grapple beam, but you might as well just come back here after getting plasma beam because of the artifact hidden behind a red door in the same room, unless you're normal and don't give a shit about getting 100% in Metroid games like me. The artifact hunt, not gonna lie, is actually quite enjoyable on a first playthrough, at least it was for me. I like that the hints you can scan at the artifact temple are all you have to go off of, and I don't think any of them are too hard to find, maybe with the exception of the one I just mentioned in Phendrana's Edge, because the door leading to it can only be seen with X-ray visor, and scanning the rock doesn't reveal that it's made of Bendesium, unlike basically every other Bendesium structure in the game. But even this artifact is one I'm sure anybody could find eventually. The name of the room it's in is literally in the hint. I felt like such a genius when I found out how to shoot down the tower hiding the artifact of Elder. One of the most nerve-wracking challenges in the game that should only be attempted for bragging rights is the artifact of Wrath. You can just barely collect it without dying before getting the Phazon suit if you have enough energy tanks, unless you're playing Remastered or the Wii version. But when you start having to look for artifacts in the Chozo ruins, you have to deal with these guys. Just f them. Without X-ray visor, they're mad annoying. And with X-ray visor, they're still mad annoying. I just avoid fighting them because even if you decide to clear the room, if you leave and come back, they have a chance of respawning. Also, I just want to share another story. When I was a kid and it came time to get the ice beam, I entered the Chozo ruins by going up this spider ball track that leads you to Flagra's room, and when I opened the door, I was so scared shitless that I turned the game off, forgetting to save by the way, and didn't play it again for about a month. A lot of parts of this game creep me out actually, like when the Space Pirate lab goes dark after you get the thermal visor, and you have Metroids breaking through their glass containments trying to give you the big suck, and if you stand too close to a bright flash of light, like from a charge shot hitting the wall, you get a jump scare of Samus's face. Huh. I wasn't as nice as I thought I was going to be about the backtracking after all. The backtracking in Prime 1 is something that I have become less tolerant of over time, and while I thought I would be able to defend it more than most do in this video, I just couldn't after my most recent playthrough. It's hard to ignore how irritating the back and forth progression can be in this game, even for someone like me who loves the game in spite of it, especially after replaying Prime 2, which handles its progression in a way that's more attractive, but I'll get to that later. And for those of you that watched my 2D Metroid videos, if you're wondering if I'm gonna go into detail about the speedrunning scene of the Prime games, not really. People do speedrun the Prime Trilogy, and Prime 1 especially, but since these are naturally just slower paced experiences as opposed to the 2D entries that featured fast-paced, complex movement and high-level play, I personally am just not as passionate about speedrunning when it comes to the Prime series. Although I would like to mention that Retro arbitrarily added things like Bendesium rocks in later versions of Prime 1 to prevent players from getting some items early, which is kind of a dick move, but it's also pretty funny. This actually inconvenienced me as well when I was capturing footage of the Wii version, which I streamed over on Twitch, you guys should check it out, because I kept finding myself short on power bombs, and I swear this had never happened to me as much as it did on that day. You have gotta be kidding me. As I've already said, where the Prime Trilogy excels is in its immersion-fueled experiences. On average, they are longer than the 2D games, they have more involved exploration given the nature of 3D environments requiring you to be more perceptive of nooks and crannies in the immediate area, and Prime is just more interested in leveraging its tech to create the most engrossing worlds in the Metroid series. Again, the attention to detail plays a big role in why these games are so enjoyable and captivating to me. Prime 1 does it the best in my opinion. From how you can see Samus's hand position change when she switches beams, matching the icon of each weapon type, and how several enemies have entirely different death animations depending on how you kill them. Yeah, the backtracking can be a pain, but it means I can revisit this room with this plant enemy, and each time I come back, I have a new toy I can use to kill it in a different way than the last time I was here, and it also highlights just how much stronger I've gotten. That is definitely something I'm glad Prime retained from the 2D games, making Samus feel like a deadly force of nature by the time you reach the end. The bosses, however, will always put up a good fight no matter how powered up you are. The first couple of bosses like Flagra and Thardas take inspiration from the puzzle-heavy nature of Prime's world design, as the way in which you defeat them isn't just about shooting them until their health is fully depleted. This may involve turning these solar panels in the Flagra fight while stopping him from switching them back to their original position, and swapping between your normal visor and your thermal visor to lock onto Thardas's weak points in the fight against him. Though something you can do to cut the amount of time you spend in this battle in half is plant bombs when he's rolling around to automatically skip the thermal visor step of each cycle. The elite pirate is quite challenging, boasting heavy firepower and the ability to call in space pirates in the middle of the fight to assist him, and Meta Ridley is honestly not very fun. The fight is unnecessarily drawn out by how often he flies away to do his bombardier attack. And unless you're playing the GameCube version where you can skip this phase completely by ramming him with the boost ball when he's on the ground, you're gonna be here for a while. But in the GameCube version, when he's in his last phase, it is incredibly difficult to get a clean shot into his mouth, thanks to the janky hit detection and the awkward angle you're given. This was thankfully fixed in later versions of the game. The first phase of the Metroid Prime fight can take a while if you didn't find many missile expansions or those powerful beam combos I talked about. And while it only has one attack in its last phase, having to swap visors to find it as it warps between dimensions and using the Phazon powered hyper beam to damage it is oh so satisfying. Coupled with the menacing rendition of Metroid 1's title theme and knowing the context of the damage this thing reaped upon Talon 4 and the Chozo that inhabited the planet, Metroid Prime is one of the best final bosses in the series and, as we'll see, is also one of its most tenacious antagonists. For as epic as the final battles of the game are, I love the stark contrast of the final scene. It is quiet, reflective, and somber, as Samus takes one last look at the destroyed artifact temple, having rid this once prosperous planet of the poison that consumed it. It's an achievement that should call for celebration, but knowing that the Chozo that lived here were already dead before the game even started, all Samus can feel is sorrow. She avenged them and fulfilled their prophecy, but she couldn't save them. A big reason that I interpret the ending this way is that it makes the next game's narrative all the more fulfilling. It feels like a redemption of sorts for Samus, a second chance to save a world. And I'll elaborate on that when I talk about Prime 2's story. That was Metroid Prime 1, one of my favorite games of all time, and a game I will keep coming back to despite some glaring flaws it has. Its exploration, atmosphere, presentation, and gameplay overshadow any and all problems I have with the game. Metroid Prime was my introduction to my favorite video game franchise, and because of that, it is a comfort game to me. It provides a familiar and fun as hell experience whenever I'm in the mood for a great freaking video game, much like Super Metroid. And whereas Prime 1 aimed to give players something that was evocative of that classic game, Retro planned for the sequel to go in a very different direction, one that is not nearly as appreciated as it should be. And it's sort of been stuck in Prime 1's shadow ever since it came out. But trust me, Metroid Prime 2 is far more than a simple echo of what came before. Metroid Prime 2 Echoes, released on November 15th, 2004 on the GameCube. Prime 2 set out to be much darker than its predecessor, both visually and tonally, and while Prime 1 played things safe with its setting and structure, Echoes gave players a Metroid experience that felt more original. Though if this game did take at least a bit of inspiration from another Metroid title, it was definitely Fusion. Despite having to deal with yet another stressful and unhealthy development period, Retro churned out a game that was every bit as immersive as their first project, with the only questionable and undercooked addition being a brand new multiplayer mode, something that was no doubt included as some kind of a response to Xbox's recently released Halo 2. This multiplayer mode gets made fun of a lot, and yeah, I wouldn't call it great and it is very unbalanced, but it can also be a lot of dumb fun. I tried it out for the first time recently with a friend, and we had quite a few laughs as we would find weapons that were hilariously overpowered. You can find this turret from the campaign and just absolutely decimate your opponent with it, and there are these multiplayer exclusive power-ups like Hacker Mode that lets you hack your opponent's suit to deal damage and mess with their vision, and my personal favorite, Death Ball, because it's called fucking Death Ball. This mode by no means is able to stand toe-to-toe with something like Halo, but I know that if I had this game as a kid, I would have gotten quite a bit of fun out of the multiplayer with my cousins and friends. Look, I'm someone who got more mileage out of Shadow the Hedgehog's versus mode than any sane individual should be willing to admit, so my standards are probably just really low. But of course, the single-player story mode is where Echoes truly shines. Metroid Prime 2 sees Samus traveling to planet Aether in search of some missing Galactic Federation troopers, and because it seems to be the Galactic Federation's MO by this point, the soldiers are already dead by the time Samus arrives. Some of them are even undead, possessed by a mysterious dark force, and Samus has to put them down. She eventually comes face to face with someone bearing a striking resemblance to her, and after chasing her doppelganger through a portal, Samus not only discovers that this dark Samus is siphoning Phazon, but that the atmosphere of the planet in this alternate dimension is toxic, leaving her defenseless and weakened as she's ambushed by a bunch of dark creatures, losing a bunch of her equipment in the process, and being shoved right back through the portal she came through. Right off the bat, Prime 2 sets the stage for a conflict that feels much grimmer and hopeless than the one in the first game. Reanimated corpses and unnatural phenomena on the planet that has somehow split its very being between a light and dark half, a creature sporting a suit powered by the great poison Samus worked so hard to rid the galaxy of last time. This is what sets Echoes apart from its predecessor the most: its tone. It is bleak, dour, and the oppressive mood of Echoes is excellently complemented by the game's color palette made of shades of browns and grays, and many aspects of the gameplay as well. For one, the difficulty. The challenge this game provides is dialed up significantly compared to the previous game. You find the base where the Galactic Federation operated from on the planet not long after the encounter with Dark Samus, and after learning that the dark creatures that attacked Samus earlier were responsible for the deaths of the soldiers, you're forced to fight some of them. And unlike the first batch of monsters you run into in Prime 1, these guys can not only take a beating, but dish it out as well. Energy tanks in the first couple of hours are few and far between, and as I'll get into later, there is an added importance placed on resource management in this game, and the bosses are some of the most aggressive in the series. While other Metroid games have dabbled in survival horror elements in isolated set pieces like Fusion's SAX sections and Dread's Emmy zones, many characteristics of the genre are present throughout the entirety of Echoes. The game is meant to elicit a sense of fear and panic, and it does this seamlessly through its presentation, story and lore, creature designs, and what is demanded of the player in order to survive. Just compare the save station animations in the first two Prime games. Previously, Samus was composed and always looked ready for battle after recharging. Here, she looks exhausted. She lets out a sigh, knowing that these precious seconds of calm should be cherished before she has to go back out into the unforgiving climate of planet Aether. And this is all without even mentioning the main gimmick of Prime 2's gameplay, one that makes even the series' trademark exploration play into the survival horror nature of this game: the dual world mechanic. See, Samus's main goal is laid out when she meets Umos, a member of an intelligent species called the Luminoth. Planet Aether was struck by a meteor some time ago that split the planet's essence in two, creating a light Aether and a dark Aether. With the use of dimensional rifts, the Ing, inhabitants of the dark half of Aether, have invaded the light half, and the Luminoth have been fighting a losing war against them over the planet's energy. If the Ing win, light Aether will cease to exist, and they will travel to other planets and take their energy as well. Samus absorbed an energy transfer module earlier after defeating the Dark Alpha Splinter, which allows her to recover and collect the planetary energy that the Ing have stolen. Out of a moral sense of right, Samus agrees to travel to the dark counterparts of the three temples on the planet to retrieve the stolen energy, saving Aether from being consumed and the Luminoth from going extinct. This is what I meant by how I see Prime 2's narrative as a redemption story. While Samus was unable to save the Chozo of Talon 4, she has a chance to save the Luminoth of Aether, and it helps that the two races are so similar, so the parallels are easier to notice. One of the first lore entries in the game even reveals that the Luminoth traveled across the galaxy long ago, meeting many enlightened minds during their travels, the Chozo being chief among them, and seeing how they settled down on Talon 4 to live in harmony with nature is what convinced the Luminoth to do the same, leading to Aether becoming their home. And sure, part of the reason that Samus agrees to help the Luminoth in their plight is definitely to stop the Ing from targeting humans next, but then you get small character moments like this one where she lowers her arm cannon when she concludes that Umos isn't a threat, and when she bids the Luminoth farewell in the ending with a simple, badass wave as she walks into the light, as if saying, "Take care of yourselves." It's easy to conclude then that the thing motivating Samus the most on this mission is her desire to save a species out of the kindness of her heart, because that's who she is. It's part of what makes Samus such a great protagonist, that time and again, she has demonstrated that she values life and will do anything to protect it. Okay, innocent life. So yeah, the story is pretty great, but like any Metroid game, it's the gameplay that either makes or breaks the experience for me. And while the core gunplay and movement hasn't evolved much since the last game, though I swear that the lock-on is less reliable this time, more than likely because of the crunch development, the ways in which you explore the planet and progress have changed. Let's talk about that Link to the Past inspired dual world mechanic I brought up earlier. The temples Samus needs to travel to are located in the Aegon Wastes, Torvus Bog, and the Sanctuary Fortress, and gaining access to the temples in Dark Aether requires you to collect the Dark Temple keys of each region. Finding them means you have to thoroughly explore both the light and dark versions of the planet, and Dark Aether is where things get interesting. The air here is poisonous, and being exposed to it rapidly depletes Samus's health. Thankfully, there are these light crystals and orbs courtesy of the Luminoth that create small bubbles of light that not only function as protective safe zones from the atmosphere, but staying in these safe zones also slowly replenishes your energy. Dark Aether punishes players who try to rush through the area without slowing down to recover health and analyzing their surroundings to find the next safe zone or door to make a dash towards. It doubles down on the Prime series' greater focus on a slower, more methodical approach to world traversal. But like any good challenging mechanic, it also punishes players who take things too slow. Light crystals might be permanent shields from the toxic air as long as they aren't hit with a blast of dark energy, but light orbs only emit their light bubbles for a short period of time, and you have to shoot them to activate the safe zone in the first place. There are few rooms in Dark Aether where you are truly safe from harm. If it isn't the air that's out to get you, it's the Ing and other possessed creatures that are more deadly than their counterparts in the light realm. Essentially, you are almost always in some kind of danger when in Dark Aether, and despite the level design mirroring what you've seen in the light half, navigation is noticeably more difficult in Light Aether as the environments can tend to blend in with one another, thanks to the dark purple hues that paint nearly every surface in this dimension. This was undoubtedly an intentional artistic choice, as nothing strikes more fear in someone than being lost in a dangerous place where your sense of direction is greatly handicapped. There are also no map stations in Dark Aether, further accentuating the disorientation one can feel when exploring this world. Even after getting the Dark Suit upon defeating a Morbus, sure, the rate at which your health drains in Dark Aether is greatly reduced, but this is counteracted with the more aggressive enemies and bosses that await you in Torvus Bog and the Sanctuary Fortress. More than ever, you are encouraged to use every weapon at your disposal to fend off the enemies of this world. This also means that expansion hunting should always be a top priority, especially in the early game when you don't have the Dark Suit, so energy tanks are especially lucrative to make exploration in Dark Aether more manageable. On top of the standard power beam and missiles, Prime 2 introduces the dark and light beams, which you get fairly early on in your adventure. The dark beam shoots out slow but powerful projectiles that have the ability to freeze some enemies if charged, much like the ice beam, and the light beam is essential for quickly taking care of any darkling enemies, as just a couple of shots incinerates many of them. But there's a catch. Both of these weapon types have their own ammunition. This means that, although they are powerful, they should be used sparingly. Yet another gameplay feature borrowed from classic survival horror games, limited resources for dealing with threats efficiently. Thankfully, almost every enemy is vulnerable to the power beam, and if there's one expansion type you should prioritize above any other, it's the one that increases your ammo capacity for the dark and light beams. Prime 2 is straight up a Resident Evil game. You've got your trusty equivalent to the pistol that is weak but reliable, and your hard-hitting magnums and shotguns and flamethrowers that use up scarce resources like nothing else, but when used wisely, can really turn the tides in your favor. Even with careful conservation of your dark and light ammo and learning the best situations to use your weapons, such as how a charged shot from the dark beam is basically kryptonite against the dark commandos, Prime 2 doesn't let up on the hostile enemies. A good chunk of them are basically beefed up versions of familiar foes from Prime 1, like the Grenchlers that appear to just be baby Sheegoth clones, except they can jump, take more firepower to put down, and can follow you underwater, and many of the new enemies either take quick reflexes or unconventional abilities to defeat. The Sanctuary Fortress, being a highly advanced fortress in the sky, is crawling with mechanoids that can hack into your suit or split into two separate enemies, one of which requires the boost ball of all things to kill, but none of the regular mobs compare to the bosses, of which Prime 2 sports many. Just to get them out of the way, there are some stinkers here, and the Boost Guardian is the stinkiest of the bunch. The game has been stingy with energy tanks by the time you get to this guy, and you're forced to fight him in a confined arena with with no light bubbles, you are given limited and short windows where you can even damage the boss, and its attack patterns are super random and damn near impossible to learn and dodge. I'm always cutting it close on health by the time I kill this dude. The hit detection on the alpha blog is just awful. Shots that I swear should hit just don't sometimes, and it actually caused my only unintentional game over for this video. And dying to this boss sucks, because the save station in this section of Torvus Bog becomes inaccessible when you open the way to the boss. So if you die, you have to go through the entire area to release the locks all over again just to get another attempt. And speaking of wonky hit detection, here's a boss I rarely hear people complain about: the Grapple Guardian. Same problem I have with the Alpha Blog. Simply trying to hit the weak point is a struggle. Like I'm just trying to shoot the fucker, what is this? But for every bad boss in this game, there are like 3 good to even great ones. Yeah, I like the Spider Guardian. I also like my fries more with ranch than with ketchup. Don't fucking judge me. It can be a frustrating fight, sure, especially on GameCube without Spring Ball, but I don't know, man. I feel like it's mostly a skill issue with people who say it's too hard. You just gotta watch out with how much you're boosting when trying to get up these half pipes without falling off, and pay more attention to whether your bomb jumps will actually get you through the maze without making you bonk, instead of trying to go super fast for the sake of it. You have more time than you may think to reach the bomb slots, and you'll just waste even more time if you're impatient and mess up. This is also one of many bosses in the game that are fought almost exclusively with the Morph Ball. In the Power Bomb Guardian fight, you have to ride the Spider Ball tracks along the edges of the arena to get to the bomb slots, and there's this drone mini-boss in the Sanctuary Fortress that asks you to use the new boost launch maneuver to dodge its electrical arms and to attack its weak point when it's exposed. And of course, there are the main area bosses that guard the Dark Temples, and these are the most comparable to the scale of Prime 1's bosses, except the Morbus, Chaika, and especially Quadraxis are all much more exciting. These bosses can take a while to defeat, but they never drag, thanks to them sporting multiple phases that each require you to come up with an all-new strategy. In the final phase of the Chaika fight, you have to shoot its appendage enough before you're able to get behind it, and use the new Seeker missiles to target onto its wings and blast them. To get into the proper position, you need to use the grapple beam to swing to the correct island and avoid the toxic swamp. And the Quadraxis fight is incredible, not just due to the spectacle of battling this giant machine, but for how each phase feels like you're fighting an entirely different enemy, which is technically how the game sees it as well, considering there are 5 separate things to scan in this fight to complete the logbook. But we don't talk about the logbook in Prime 2. It's awful. There are a bunch of missable scans, different versions of the same enemies to scan, inconsistent research scans. Just don't do it. I should really take my own advice. So yeah, I think the bosses are a lot more fun this time around. And the funny thing is that this isn't even the area where I think Prime 2 introduced the most improvement over Prime 1. Echoes is simultaneously more straightforward and less straightforward than the last game when it comes to progression and exploration, but in ways that I feel enhance the experience. Broadly speaking, Prime 2 is one of the more linear games in the series, in the sense that you always have a clear objective and can, for the most part, stay in one region until you fully complete it. But the self-contained regions themselves still sport branching paths, multi-layered level construction, and the familiar formula of unlocking more of the region after getting a new upgrade. In general, each area sports some of the most complex puzzles and pathfinding in the series, with the mechanic largely responsible for the latter of the two being the interdimensional exploration. Samus has to frequently cross between the light and dark versions of Aether to reach the next point of interest, and some of the game's puzzles also transcend dimensions. At multiple points, you will have to use a bomb slot or a spinner mechanism in Dark Aether to affect something in Light Aether and open up a new route that was previously blocked off. There is still backtracking in this game, but it's a much lighter version of it. Prime 2's instances of back and forth exploration are more condensed and less egregious than the backtracking in Prime 1 that would often cover the entire world map at times. There are a couple of times in Echoes where you'll actually have to leave the region you're in to get an item you need to make progress in said region, but even these examples aren't as bad as they could have been. To reach the submerged part of Torvus Bog, you need the Seeker missiles found in the temple grounds. Getting to the upgrade involves nothing more than a quick elevator escalator ride back to that region and a handful of rooms to run through. Same goes for the detour required to get the power bombs. This is thanks to how Prime 2's world is set up. Taking nods from Fusion, the temple ground serves as a hub that connects to every other region, and each region has an adjacent connection to the one right next to it. The areas in this game also don't suffer from the Magmor Caverns problem of being glorified straight lines, so it shouldn't take you more than a couple of minutes most of the time to get to where you need to be at. While Dark Aether tends to be more segmented, often requiring you to swap between the light and dark versions of the area to properly navigate it, it forces you to think fourth dimensionally about the map, and really makes you think about how the levels are built more than Prime 1 did. Though, since I'm talking about the map, if I can nitpick something, it's, well, the map. I didn't have much of a problem with it in Prime 1. In fact, I actually think it's quite impressive how the game's world was able to be depicted with simple polygonal shapes, and it often did a good job illustrating how everything was laid out in relation to where I was. Prime 2 functionally has the same map system, but because of the multi-layered construction of some of these areas that I brought up earlier, the map doesn't do a great job separating these layers when viewed from certain angles. And with the simple holographic geometry, it reminds me of that Virtual Boy game, Red Alarm, because looking at this for an extended period of time messes with my eyes and tricks my brain into thinking I'm looking at the map from one angle when really I'm actually looking at it from an entirely different one. It almost creates this optical illusion where a room I think is in the foreground is actually in the background. But I mean, it really is just a nitpick, and it's one I bring up because I find there to be very few problems in Prime 2 for me to justifiably get worked up about. Like, I could bitch about the lack of control you're given with a screw attack, but in hindsight it's not that big of a deal. And I actually love how many shortcuts this upgrade opens up in the endgame when you're looking for the Sky Temple keys, for instance. Though I don't love the tight spaces you're asked to jump into at times. The teleporters in the energy controller rooms you unlock after getting the light suit are also a welcome inclusion for this MacGuffin hunt. And can I just say that the light suit doesn't get as much love as I think it should? It looks awesome. Just watch out for those kneecaps, that shit's a safety hazard. The Various suit also looks great in this game, an improvement over Prime 1 in my opinion. It's less bulky, the proportions are just right, and I like how scuffed it looks in Echoes, as if it's battle damage the suit has sustained over time, which fits this game's aesthetic very well. I'm not exactly a huge fan of the Echo visor, and some of the reuse of enemies and level set pieces from Prime 1 can be kind of distracting I guess, but then I think about the cool maneuvers Samus can do, like the previously mentioned boost launch, opening the door for some of the most creative morph ball puzzles I've seen in a Metroid game. I love the added touch of the color-coded blast shields on doors referencing Super Metroid. And speaking of callbacks, Dark Samus is a welcome take on the SAX concept from Fusion, and you fight her 3 times during the story, giving us the most frantic and fast-paced battles in the game. Except again, I struggle just trying to lock onto this shithead. And of course, I can't not mention the music that plays in the flooded section of Torvis Bog. What an excellent reuse of the Red Brinstar theme from Super Metroid. It fits so well that it has effectively made me associate this theme with water levels, and whenever I replay Super Metroid and reach Meridia, I'm half expecting to hear this song there. Prime 2 is filled with musical masterpieces throughout, and it carries the same type of instrumentation used in the last game's soundtrack. The Aegon Waste track sounds so foreboding and threatening, fitting the wastelandish look of the area and the murky sky that lights up with strikes of lightning as you run through the desert. The prevailing synth in the Sanctuary Fortress theme combined with the choir-like chanting is perfect for this region. A beacon of technological advancement stationed on cliffsides high above what appears to be a wondrous city now taken over by the Luminauts' very own creations. The song captures both the majesty and the despair of this area, and is by and large my favorite location on Aether. Echoes succeeds in selling a monumental, epic adventure with the help of its music, visuals, story, larger-than-life boss encounters, and it successfully captures the isolation and high stakes of a good Metroid campaign with Dark Aether and the level of challenge the game provides with its puzzles, progression, enemies, and resource management. The tough journey you go on to restore Aether makes the hunt for the Sky Temple keys at the end of the game feel cathartic. Now that you're decked out in a suit that ignores the corrosive atmosphere of Dark Aether and the fittingly named Annihilator Beam that shreds foes with little effort. The ending is a high-octane mini boss rush where you face off against the multi-phase Emperor Ing and Dark Samus back to back. The final battle against Dark Samus has you fighting her under a time limit, as Dark Aether implodes in on itself and a remix of the classic Escape theme plays in the background. It's anxiety-inducing and a great conclusion to the game. This time around, the final cutscenes are less bittersweet and more triumphant and feel good. Something about the way the Luminoth bow to Samus out of respect and thanks as she takes her leave always puts a smile on my face. If this wasn't a trilogy, I'd argue that this would have been a satisfying send-off for Prime, as long as you ignore the post-credit scene of course. Fun fact, this was the first time the modern Zero Suit design for Samus appeared in 3D, after it made its proper debut in Zero Mission just a couple of months before Prime 2 came out. That's crazy to think about. That's twice this generation where 2 Metroid games launched in the same year, and all of them were phenomenal. It really was a golden age for the franchise. For as much praise as I've showered Echoes with for the past 25 minutes or so, you'd think that I like it more than Prime 1, and yeah, a part of me does. On paper, Prime 2 should be my favorite of the trilogy. It builds upon so much of what came before, and to be real here, yeah, biases aside, I humbly believe that Echoes is the best Metroid Prime game. But I still like Prime 1 more. Is it nostalgia? Yes, almost definitely. But similar to my thoughts on Majora's Mask when compared to Ocarina of Time, I have to be in a certain mood to replay Prime 2. Its darker tone and greater challenge are things that I love like in Majora, but the familiarity and coziness that games like Prime 1 and Ocarina give off make them more enticing to me when it comes to choosing which one to play through again. And in the case of Metroid specifically, I value replayability a ton. So for me, Prime 1 takes the crown. Prime 2 is also a longer game, generally speaking. Nothing outlandish for Metroid standards, but just something I wanted to point out. Unfortunately, although Prime 2 reviewed well when it came out, it didn't sell anywhere near as many copies as Prime 1. Maybe it was the higher difficulty, the bleaker graphics, the fact that sequels rarely perform as well as their predecessors, or the competition at the time that made Echoes fly under the radar. Whatever the case, maybe Prime needed to do something a little different for the next installment. And that's exactly what Retro believed as well when developing Metroid Prime 3. But did this evolution push the series to greater heights, or simply corrupt what was already great? In between Prime 2 and Prime 3, 2 other Metroid Prime games released that weren't developed by Retro Studios, both of which launched on the Nintendo DS. First, there was Metroid Prime Pinball in 2005, a Prime-themed pinball game where the pinball is Samus in Morph Ball mode and the levels are themed around locations from Prime 1. If Mario can do it, why not Metroid? In defense of this game, Prime Pinball isn't all too bad. It's actually quite fun in quick bursts. You got enemies and even bosses to fight to score points, collectibles, certain spots on the field to aim for to earn score bonuses. It's pinball. It's a neat distraction at worst and kind of addicting at best, and I personally wouldn't mind a sequel or something along those lines. Make it a $20 eShop title with online leaderboards and such. But of course, Metroid Prime Hunters is the more interesting game between the two. A Prime game that actually looked and played like a Prime game on a handheld. This game kind of blows. The fact that they got a Metroid Prime game running on the DS is impressive, but man, Hunters is just a slog to play. The controls are horrible. You have to hold the system with your left hand and aim and perform various actions like jumping with the touchscreen. Looking back, the controls aren't too different from something like Kid Icarus Uprising, a game I love, but I can look past the wrist pain inducing control scheme in that game because of its endearing characters and fun missions. Even if Hunters didn't make my hands flare up just from playing it for a couple of minutes, there isn't much here to salvage the rest of the experience. The levels are dull, the bosses are dull, the game is just dull all around. I'd rather play, yeah, that. So why am I even bringing this game up if all I'm gonna do is bitch about it? Well, that's because Hunters isn't really revered for its single player campaign. The local and online multiplayer was the main attraction, so much so that some of the multiplayer arenas appear as regular rooms in the story mode. Of course, being a PvP mode, the gunplay was the center of attention here, and it puts Hunters in this interesting position in the franchise's history where it almost marks the beginning of Prime's temporary shift in focus from being less of a first-person action-adventure series to something that more closely resembles the thing fans feared Prime 1 was going to be when it was first revealed, a derivative first-person shooter that sacrificed the explorative nature of Metroid in favor of running and gunning. This isn't to say that Prime lost its identity outright, no. Metroid Prime 3, for as much as it leans in on being a more shooter-centric game than 1 and 2, still has a lot going for it, and I'm going to make sure to point out all the things I like about the game. But there are many reasons why some now regard it as the black sheep of the trilogy, and it all starts with the console it released on. The Nintendo Wii was on fire for the first couple of years of its life. The Wiimote and games like Wii Sports made people who may have never played video games before flock to the system. And this put Nintendo in an awkward position. They had this casual dominated install base now, but they couldn't just ignore their hardcore fans either. This led to many of their games that came out for the Wii to adopt more beginner-friendly design philosophies in an attempt to appeal to everybody. For some games, in fact I'd argue for most of Nintendo's flagship releases this generation, this worked out great. Super Mario Galaxy took more inspiration from 2D Mario with tighter focus, set-piece driven level design, and more restricted movement. Super Smash Bros. Brawl made its gameplay more approachable and simple for newcomers. But then there were games like Super Paper Mario, which ditched turn-based combat, and Skyward Sword, which gave fans a much more linear and railroaded Zelda adventure, all in the name of accessibility. And the third Metroid Prime game would follow suit. Metroid Prime 3 Corruption was designed to be as accessible as possible to players who didn't play the first two games. This didn't just mean adding pointer and motion controls to justify the controller you play the game with, this also affected the game's world and level design, structure, difficulty, and story. Prime 3 has a notoriously slower opening than Prime 1 and 2. By that, I mean that the game is a lot more text and cutscene heavy, and you're heavily guided through the first hour or two of Prime 3. No longer does it feel like you're on your own, acting as the world's greatest bounty hunter and one-man army exploring an alien planet. Now you've always got somebody chiming in, telling you about your next objective, even if you go in the options menu to disable the hint system. All that does is prevent the game from marking your next destination on your map. Yep, Prime 3 is very linear, and it is most apparent in the game's intro. But I'm going to take a bit of time and actually talk about the advantages that linearity brings to a Prime game. As I've gone into many times before on the channel, I don't dislike when a game is more linear, as long as the more scripted nature of the game is used to its full potential, and Prime 3 uses this structure to deliver a bombastic and explosive beginning to the adventure. Samus arrives at the GF Olympus, a Galactic Federation ship, to meet up with three other bounty hunters, Rundus, Gore, and Gandrada. They're informed by Admiral Dane and the ship's Aurora unit, basically a supercomputer, that the Federation's entire network of Aurora units have been infected with the virus. But as the briefing is coming to a close, the Olympus is attacked by space pirates. What follows is an hour-long sequence that involves fighting your way through the Olympus to get back to your ship and exploring the planet Norian to get some cannons back online before the planet is struck by a large meteor that arrived via a wormhole. During this, you'll see lots of explosions, shoot a lot of shit, see Galactic Federation soldiers actually being competent for once, and fight two bosses, one of whom being the returning Meta Ridley, who you fight while falling down this long shaft, avoiding his fireballs and getting up close and personal to shoot the bastard right in his fucking mouth. This is Prime 3's greatest strength. It is the most action-packed and kinetic Prime game of the bunch. Hell, it's probably the most action-packed game in the entire Metroid series. The game has a brisk pace, and because of how linear it isn't as easy to get lost like in the previous games, meaning there is very little downtime in between all the gunfights. But as a result, this is also one of the game's main detriments to those who are fans of how Metroid is typically structured. In an attempt to make this the most thrilling Metroid game to date for newcomers, Metroid Prime 3 lags behind its contemporaries when it comes to being an immersive, atmospheric experience. It can still deliver in that area, no doubt. Corruption has Samus exploring a variety of different planets this time around, and they all look incredible. From the gorgeous vistas of Skytown Elysia to the hellish environment of the pirate homeworld, Prime 3's environments are just as impressive on a visual level as the ones in the first two games. One section of Brio has this really cool moment where you find a portal and are transported from the fiery hellscape of the area you were in to the freezing working conditions of Brio ice. This portal is the only way you can access this part of the planet, and it makes for one of Prime 3's more memorable moments. It's mysterious and alluring, especially as you investigate the level when you arrive and see the giant statues depicting a Chozo and one of the Brio natives. It gives me that same feeling of when I found the Artifact Temple and Hall of Elders in Prime 1, and I can't praise that about this area enough. However, this is a more linear Metroid game, which means the level design is simpler and not as complex. The puzzles within the levels are still pretty fun to solve, but the actual exploration in Prime 3, I don't find it to be as fulfilling as what came before, and a lot of that has to do with the hand-holding. There was an appeal to getting lost and not immediately knowing where to go, and master the fastest ways of getting around to minimize the backtracking those games would ask me to do. This added to the immersion and illusion of feeling like I was in Samus's shoes. Prime 3 just doesn't give me that same kind of satisfaction with its take on exploration. I never got lost in this game, not even on my first playthrough, which actually is the only other time I've fully completed this game outside of the run I did for this video. That's right, I've only played through all of Corruption twice in my life. For me, and for this being a Metroid game, that's unimpressive. Something I constantly feel when playing this game is the feeling that I'm on autopilot. Because the world design and progression is so simplified, I don't have as much of a reason to fully engage with the game, outside of those occasional curated set pieces and other moments that I have yet to get into. The game also dips into old habits every now and again, specifically when it comes to backtracking. Getting the plasma beam requires you to run through all of Skytown Elysia to fight Gore to get the weapon from him, and immediately turn back to get to the other side of the map again. Very Prime 1-esque, which isn't exactly a good thing. This segment also highlighted how unexciting these grapple beam rails are after just a couple of trips. You're just waiting and occasionally shooting an obstacle or two in your path until you reach the other side. It looks neat, sells just how large the city is, but it gets kinda dull, and Elysia is my least favorite planet to explore because of this. It doesn't help that so many of the interior sections of the planet feel like they were just copy and pasted. Sanctuary Fortress, this ain't. The trip to get the screw attack, on the other hand, admittedly isn't too bad, and it helps that it takes you to Brio Ice, which I commended earlier, so there's at least a change in scenery. Due to the segmented nature of the planets in this game, you are also able to pick the closest landing site to the screw attack when going back to Brio, which is much appreciated. Really, what bothered me more than anything about this detour was this.
Samus, perhaps what you require to access the Federation landing site in the east is not on this planet. The item you need may reside on a world you have previously visited.
Ah yes, this is a video game where I have to get X item to continue the story, and X item is probably in a different location because that's how video games work, am I right? I'm sorry, I've just always found this moment to be distractingly immersion breaking, and it just drives my point home about the unfulfilling exploration and Corruption. It doesn't help that even the optional content this time around doesn't quite meet my exploration needs either. Many of the expansions in Prime 3 require very little dexterity to find. A good chunk of them are even just flat out handed to you on the main story path, or found with minimal deviation from that path. This game loves giving you energy tanks, which definitely plays into a mechanic that I'll talk about shortly, and it also plays into the whole accessibility factor of this game yet again, just like how there are now checkpoints that you respawn at when you get a game over, which I actually don't mind that last part. If it's to prevent another alpha block situation, then I'm all for it. If you're wondering if I'm also going to complain about the addition of item dots on the map that reveal the locations of hidden upgrades, no actually. I think this is a great quality of life feature. It's no different than how the 2D games handled item tracking after Super Metroid, and I'd actually argue that it's better than those games, because it's completely optional in Prime 3. You don't actually get this data added to your map unless you activate these satellites in Elysia, which in and of themselves are easily missable. But yeah, 100%ing this game was kind of a cakewalk, more so because of how easy it was to obtain the items than figuring out where they all were. The allure of item hunting in other Metroid games was never really about pinpointing where exactly the item was hidden. It was about the challenge that came from getting to it after the fact. In this regard, I think Prime 3 just isn't as good, yet again. And, okay, I've just gotta come out and say it. A big reason why I'm being so hard on Prime 3 is because it was the only one of the trilogy that I got bored with before reaching the credits. To be fair, this happened while I was in the middle of the item cleanup, which is completely optional, but it was just the straw that broke the camel's back. The pressure had been building throughout my whole playthrough, and the fatigue I felt nearing the end of the game can mostly be attributed to the gameplay. The combat, to be more specific. Metroid Prime 3 is a very gun-happy game, as I've alluded to already, but the crux of the issue is in just how limited you are in terms of the options you're given for combat, and how one mechanic in particular completely overshadows the few options you do have. First off, of all the games that could have justified beam swapping the most, it should have been Prime 3, but nope. The beam upgrades you get in this game, the returning plasma beam and the new Nova beam, which is basically like the wave and plasma beams combined, what with the green color and the ability to shoot through phasite, they all stack, kind of like the 2D games. But they could have been a lot more practical and interesting if they functioned similarly to the beams in Prime 1 and 2, where each beam had its pros and cons, giving you incentive to switch between them. Now your beam is rapid fire no matter what. It just gets stronger and updated with new properties used for puzzles and progression. I almost forgot that there are also no beam combos anymore either, which just, why? Missiles are just, am I the only one who doesn't really use missiles in this game? I feel like they're so slow to fire and inaccurate. In the other games, they were a bit faster and had reliable homing properties, and this is ignoring the rapid fire trick in Prime 1. Missiles gave you a way to quickly deal a good amount of damage, with the trade-off of being slightly weaker than a fully charged cannon shot. In Prime 3, I think they were nerfed just a little too much. You do get ice missiles in this game, and I like how they're used in the environment and puzzle solving, but for freezing enemies, again, I find that the missiles rarely land, and it often takes more than one to freeze an enemy completely, and they're next to useless against Metroids, since they can phase in and out of dimensions in Prime 3. They really want you to just use the X-ray visor or hyper mode against these guys. Which leads me to the PED system. The attack on Norian at the beginning of the game ends with all the bounty hunters, Samus included, getting a taste of some good old phase-on, courtesy of the returning Dark Samus. This sends Samus into a month-long coma, and upon waking up, she discovers that the Federation outfitted her suit with a phase-on enhancement device, or PED for short, so that she can channel the phase-on now swimming around in her into powerful attacks by activating Hyper Mode. Yeah, remember the Hyper Beam from the end of Prime 1? You just have access to it now at all times, or a version of it at least, as long as you have an energy tank to spare to activate Hyper Mode. You'll unlock more phase-on abilities every time you beat one of the major bosses and destroy a Leviathan Seed, but trust me, when it comes to combat, your regular beam in Hyper Mode is more than enough to eliminate threats. Hyper Mode is not only uber powerful to the point of being game-breaking, it is also the most optimal combat option at nearly any given opportunity. There are mechanics that attempt to restrain how useful Hyper Mode is. As I stated, Samus needs to inject a full energy tank to even activate Hyper Mode, and once the bar at the top of the screen is depleted, she not only exits Hyper Mode automatically, the energy tank she used is also gone and has to be replenished. The thing is, energy pickups are plentiful in this game. Regular mooks and bosses alike drop a lot of health while you're fighting them. You can also exit Hyper Mode whenever you want, to conserve the remaining energy you didn't use up yet, making it really easy to just enter this mode for a couple of seconds to dispatch one troublesome enemy and then immediately cancel it. You can't remain in Hyper Mode for too long though, or else corruption will start to set in. If Samus does get corrupted, you have to dispel the excess phase-on by shooting over and over before it kills her. Honestly though, you should never run the risk of corruption in the first place. Like I said, you can cancel Hyper Mode at any time as long as Samus isn't corrupted. So if you find yourself taking too long to kill some enemies while in Hyper Mode, just hold down the plus button and voila. Just try again in a bit when you have a clearer shot. The biggest problem with Hyper Mode is that Metroid Prime 3 funnels the player down a path where they would be foolish to not use it as much as they can. My main gripe with it is twofold. It makes the game too easy and mindless when activated, but also makes the game too monotonous when it isn't activated. So many enemies in this game are total damage sponges if you try to take them on with ordinary weapons, and occasionally you'll run into enemies with their own Hyper Mode where they deal more damage and have more health. This problem is especially bad in the pirate homeworld, where nearly every space pirate has armor on, necessitating a comically high number of beam shots and missiles to take just one of them down, unless you activate Hyper Mode, in which case they go down in a matter of seconds. Hyper Mode is an overcorrection for a problem that was only introduced to make players use Hyper Mode. It is almost always the best way to deal with enemies, and sometimes it feels like it's the only way you should be dealing with enemies. Yeah, you get the X-ray visor, which, as I mentioned previously, now has the ability to let you target an enemy's weak point, which is really awesome. It's one of my favorite new abilities in the game, and probably my favorite implementation of the X-ray visor in any Metroid game. But then I ask myself, do I really want to go to the trouble of selecting this visor and be accurate with my shots for the sake of a quick kill, or should I just... I tried playing as much of this game as I could outside of hyper mode, but it just makes combat feel like a chore when I'm up against enemies that take forever to kill with normal weapons. Sometimes it feels like I'm even punished for it. Enemies that have hyper mode variants can activate it mid-fight, so it just makes me go, well damn, I should have just activated my own hyper mode from the beginning instead of wasting all that time trying to fight normally. This is why the boredom began to set in. When every combat encounter just started to boil down to the same strategy over and over again, I got tired. I got tired of Metroid Prime 3's constrained design, and that's a shame because if they really wanted to put their efforts on combat over everything else, I wouldn't be taking so much of an issue with it if it was just fleshed out more. Kinda reminds me of another game. Retro said that more than any other Prime game, they were inspired by Halo when developing Corruption. But first-person shooters like Halo and Doom are so successful because of the weapon and enemy variety that keeps the combat fresh and compelling. Prime 3 misses the mark in that respect. Every now and then you have to yank an enemy's armor plating off with a grapple lasso, but combat in this game, at least against non-boss enemies, doesn't get much more exciting or interesting than that. Plus, this thing doesn't even work half of the damn time. Yeah, I know I said I like the pointer controls in Prime 1 and 2, but since Prime 3 was built from the ground up to be a Wii title, its use of motion controls just come off as feeling gimmicky and unnecessary. The grapple lasso, fun idea and concept, not well executed if you ask me. It just doesn't work sometimes. I'm over here jacking this damn nunchuck off and I still can't get it to consistently work. I think it's also best to play this game with the free aim enabled. Again, I didn't find this necessary in the first two games because they were originally designed with an ultra-accurate lock-on system, but in Prime 3, it's advantageous being able to aim freely while keeping an enemy in your sights to have a more comfortable way of shooting their weak points. The game itself even defaults to this setting against certain bosses. It is simply the optimal way to play this game because of how a good chunk of its enemies are designed. Look, I know I've been mostly negative about Prime 3 until now. If it isn't obvious, this is my least favorite of the trilogy, but that isn't to say that I think it's a bad game. Playing basically every Metroid game again for this video has reaffirmed my stance on Metroid being my favorite game series of all time, because even what I'd consider to be its worst entries are still good, or at the very least have some good ideas going for them. Yes, even that one. I saved the stuff that I really love about Corruption for the end of this segment, so as not to end on such a dour note, because the game certainly doesn't either, that's for sure. The story, for one thing, is possibly the most personal for Samus yet. While the PED modifications made to her suit allow her to tap into the phazon coursing within her for a boost to her firepower, the negative effects of the poison rear their ugly head fairly early into the game. The whole Corruption theme isn't just explored through hyper mode. It is integral to the narrative, as it is the primary thing Samus is fighting against internally, as she learns when she comes across her fellow bounty hunters who are also outfitted with PED tech. The phazon corruption lends them susceptible to possession by Dark Samus. They become puppets, disciples forced to carry out her every command, with no control over their own bodies. Even the space pirates themselves are suffering from the same mind control. Reading through the data logs found in the pirate homeworld is pretty unnerving. Learning how their entire fleet now exists for the sole purpose of obeying Dark Samus's will and goal to spread her corruption across the entire galaxy with the Leviathan seeds, the sources of the phazon viruses that shut down all of the Federation's Aurora units. One by one, Samus has to put down her comrades, with each mercy kill taking more of a toll on her mental and emotional well-being, as each one is a reminder of how she could end up if she fails to purge the phazon once and for all. Look at how she clenches her fist in anger when Gore is defeated. As players, we didn't get much time to spend with these warriors, but witnessing the effect their deaths has on Samus works wonders for making her relatable like in Prime 2, and making us care and empathize with her situation. Rundus is the first of the bounty hunters you fight. He glides around the arena with his ice powers, which always reminded me of Frozone from The Incredibles. When you defeat him, he dies in a brutal way, getting impaled by his own icicles, allowing Dark Samus to absorb his energy. Some seem to think that this is Rundus himself deciding to end his life to prevent Dark Samus from possessing him again after regaining his autonomy, but I don't know. I've always viewed this as Dark Samus's own doing, as a way to punish Rundus in a way for being able to break free of her possession, and also as a way to taunt Samus, which she does often during the story. This is especially apparent in the fight against Scandrata. She's my favorite boss in the game when looked at through both the gameplay and narrative context. Her shapeshifting ability allows her to take the form of bosses you've already fought, including the other two bounty hunters, and she can even transform into Samus herself, taking notes from the Boost Guardian and zooming around the arena to attack you, only you have a lot more room now to avoid her. I just don't like how she leaps onto you and you have to waggle the controllers to shake her off. My mom warned me about girls like you. The way she dies is so sinister and messed up on Dark Samus's part. She begins shapeshifting uncontrollably, and the last form she takes is Samus. Not in her familiar Varia suit design which Scandrata used during the fight, but in her PED suit, an exact mirror image of Samus's current look. No doubt done intentionally to emphasize the fact that Samus runs the risk of succumbing to the same fate, and it chills her to the bone as she has to look away, unable to see herself reaching out in agony. This is Dark Samus directly telling our hero, this is going to be you soon, and there's nothing you can do about it. The entire trilogy is a nightmare that Samus lives through that only intensifies with each game, and Metroid Prime, Dark Samus, is at the center of that nightmare. It's a virus, a plague, one that Samus must put a stop to no matter the cost, despite her being in the worst shape she's ever been in. You can even see just how bad of shape she's in when your scan visor is selected. The other Prime games allowed you to get brief glimpses of Samus's face reflected on her visor when there was a nearby flash of light. Prime 3 makes this detail much easier to notice because you can see the phase-on changing her physical appearance. It's creepy and an effective use of body horror, for lack of a better term, to demonstrate the brutality of the corruption. The only way to put an end to all of this is by taking the fight to the very source of the nightmare, Phase, a planet made of pure phase-on. That's kinda silly. It's like if our planet was called Earth because it's made of... I really gotta shut the fuck up sometimes. In order to reach Phase though, Samus and the Federation need to get there through a wormhole by taking control of a Leviathan battleship. To do that, a code is needed, located in the GFS Valhalla, and to explore the abandoned ship, you need energy cells, Prime 3's equivalent to the Chozo artifacts and the Sky Temple keys. While I didn't mind these endgame MacGuffin quests that much, a lot of fans did not enjoy them. So Prime 3's answer was not to ditch the concept entirely, but to simply make it easier for most players to get the 5 required energy cells needed to find the code on the Valhalla. Yes, out of 9 energy cells, you only need 5 at the bare minimum to beat the game, as long as you use them properly on the ship. Getting the others simply unlocks extra expansions. I think this was a great compromise and greatly benefits Prime 3's pacing for those who aren't completionists. And I know that I said I started to get bored near the end of the game, but the final area was quick to wake me back up. The game just says screw it and embraces its infatuation with having you shoot things like a maniac by making Samus enter a permanent hyper mode for the rest of the game after landing on Phase. Just like its intro, Corruption's conclusion is a high energy romp through the planet, culminating in a double boss fight against Dark Samus and the Aurora unit that was stolen from the Valhalla, which kicked off the game's plot. What can I say? It is very cathartic being able to use your most powerful abilities in these last 2 fights, and I couldn't think of a better way of killing one of the most relentless villains in the entire franchise. Phase explodes and Samus narrowly escapes, as is tradition at this point, now free of the corruption that threatened her life. I've always found it funny that she has a button on her ship with its primary purpose being to transmit a mission complete signal. Like as if doing this sort of thing over the course of so many games, it just made sense to modify her ship with it. Just makes Samus come off as the confident badass she knows she is. I'm disappointed that I didn't find more to love about Metroid Prime 3 than I would have liked, but I was left pleased with how conclusive it felt to the trilogy as a whole. Maybe it could have turned out entirely different if Retro wasn't held back by the Wii's hardware and were able to implement the bigger world they had envisioned for the game. Who knows what the scrapped bounty hunting concept would have played like in practice. I could point out more nitpicks I have, like the inferior scanning system and the underutilization of Samus's gunship that I almost forgot to mention, but in my defense it feels like the game forgot about it too. It is a very flawed game, but I still got a good amount of enjoyment from it. It just had a lot to live up to when the first 2 Prime games are some of the best action-adventure games out there. In the end, I still think it's a good game. It looks great, sounds great. Please don't crucify me. Regardless of what I or anyone else might think about Prime 3, it is unfortunate that it only managed to sell 1.31 million units, not much more than Prime 2 managed to sell. They sure picked the wrong time to make Prime feel like more of a Halo knockoff than ever, because 2007 was also when Halo 3 came out, which went down in history as one of the biggest moments in video games. What do you think hardcore gamers wanted to play more? The Second Coming of Christ, or
Twist it. Pull it. Pop it.
Corruption apparently also wasn't marketed very well. Nintendo banked on this Wii channel app to do most of the heavy lifting in advertising the game. Give me an L, give me an M, give me an A, give me an O. You really expected Uncle Tony to connect his Wii to the internet to download software from the Wii Shop channel so we can learn more about the new Metroid Prime game? You lost him at download. But for a while there, this was the end of Prime. It didn't go out with a bang per se. It was more of a poof. And despite the 100% ending teasing the return of Sylix from Hunters, Retro Studios stated that Corruption was the official end of the Prime series, at least with them at the helm. So, yeah, that was it for Metroid Prime. Guess what? In 2009, we got Metroid Prime Trilogy for the Wii, a collection of the numbered Metroid Prime games, giving Prime 1 and 2 the pointer controls from Prime 3, and adding a whole lot of bonus content with these tokens you can earn, also originally introduced in 3, that can be used to unlock artwork and the soundtracks in the extras menu. I already said I like the updated controls for the first 2 games. I've got nothing else to say about that. Though fun fact, this wasn't the first time the first 2 Prime games got the Wii pointer control treatment. That happened a couple of years prior in Japan only, with the new play control versions of Prime 1 and 2. Metroid Prime Trilogy is just these versions finally getting an official localization, only without the cool Wii startup screens. Metroid Prime Trilogy was how I first played Prime 2 and 3, but it wasn't on the Wii. I played them on Wii U when the collection was put up on the eShop, and for a limited time, the game was being sold for a clean $10. This was a steal and is still one of Nintendo's best deals in recent memory, and it finally made the Trilogy collection feasibly obtainable for the 3 people who had a Wii U. When the compilation first came out on Wii, it came in a collector's edition. You got the game, of course, as well as a steelbook in this fancy protective sleeve. Stock of this edition sold out fast and was quickly discontinued, but the game was sold again in a standard Wii case a couple of years later, only at GameStop. Copies still weren't exactly readily available at all times, and they were all pre-owned, letting GameStop control the market value of Prime Trilogy at retailers, thus allowing them to dictate the price it should be sold at, which was usually ludicrously high. And they did the same thing with Xenoblade, those fucking assholes. But after this, Metroid went through another hiatus, a drought that lasted 6 years from 2010 to 2016. And you all probably know by now that 2015 to 2016 was a rough time to be a Nintendo fan. Beloved Nintendo president Satoru Iwata passed away, the Wii U continued to financially disappoint, and the company's game output just wasn't very exciting or innovative during this time. Then came E3 2015, one of the worst in Nintendo's history. At the time, I admit it didn't seem all too bad. The showcase itself featured these charming Muppets representing the 3 biggest faces of Nintendo during this time, and they even brought back the Nintendo World Championships competition from the 90s. We got a lot of new Mario Maker gameplay, and this cute little eShop looking title called Blast Ball. Think of Rocket League but with FPS gameplay. It was a harmless new IP. In hindsight, Nintendo's presence at the conference was lackluster, and the actual content of the digital event consisted of a half-baked looking Star Fox game, a mediocre looking Mario Tennis game, an Amiibo festival, and if you're gonna beat the poor kid that much while he's down, you might as well just fucking shoot him. Metroid Prime Federation Force is the ultimate example of wrong place, wrong time. It marked the return of Metroid after 5 years with no new games, and the return of Metroid Prime after 8 years with no new games. And what was it? A multiplayer focused spin-off with an unappealing art style using the Metroid Prime name for nothing more than attention. It didn't matter if the game ended up being good or not, because people made up their minds as soon as that first trailer was shown. It was dead on arrival. It was more insulting seeing that Nintendo decided to shadow reveal it at the Championships event, and that they tried passing it off as a generic FPS soccer game at first. So that's what people viewed the game as, a generic shooter with a Metroid Prime coat of paint. The game was released in August of 2016 with very little fanfare, and was discontinued in no time at all. I wholeheartedly believe that if it came out during a time where the Metroid series was thriving with new games in the mainline series, Federation Force would have gone down as a cult hit, because it's not bad. It's not a bad game. It knows what it is and doesn't really try to be more than that, but what is here is competent. And while I haven't gotten the chance to play co-op, I've heard that it can be a very fun time. But like I said, dead on arrival. It didn't matter. The very idea of Federation Force left a bad taste in my mouth given the timing of its announcement and release, but I'd be a goddamn jackass if I let it taint my perception of the Prime games as a collective. I love these games, and despite official statements from Retro themselves, all I wanted for a while there was a proper return to this style of Metroid. Prime is an exciting interpretation of the classic Metroid formula, and while I don't absolutely adore every game in this sub-series, I will always admire the infinite potential that Prime holds. And well, thankfully, my wishes were heard loud and clear. But that's a story for another time, one that goes beyond this Metroid Prime retrospective. Mic drop. And besides, there is still one thing standing in my way before I can even think about properly talking about Metroid Prime 4. Don't know when it'll happen, and I've got plenty of other games I'd much rather make videos on right now, but stay tuned. And as always, thanks for watching, and thank you for 10,000 subscribers. Yeah, this was technically the 10,000 subscriber special. We're not even at 10k anymore. We've passed 11k. That's absurd. Thank you all. I really mean it.